The first time I led a program on gay rights as a humanistic rabbi was in October of 2003. I was a rabbi at the Birmingham Temple at the time in suburban Detroit. And the title of the program was The Future of Gay Rights. We were doing a program with an organization called the Triangle Foundation and its founding executive director, Jeff Montgomery. And I remember the conversation was very interesting. The audience turnout was somewhat small. I was kind of surprised given that it had been a very topical issue. And I remember in particular, one of the topics that we touched on was a brand new TV show that had just debuted that summer in July of 2003. It was a show called Queer Eye for the Straight Guy. Some of you may remember that original show all the way back in 2003. And we commented on how revolutionary that program was, because it was not presenting gay people as something odd or strange or to be fixed. They were the experts. They had knowledge and expertise that straight people needed to improve their lives. And they were all different. And some were more, quote, flaming than others. But the reality was, it was real people with personalities, and it was a wonderful experience to see something like that in popular media. It was on Bravo, which was on cable. It wasn't on the main broadcast stations at the time, but it was still revolutionary. After all, it had only been 6 years before, in 1997, that Ellen DeGeneres shocked the world by having a same-sex kiss on primetime television. And it was just 5 years since the debut of a sitcom called Will and Grace, which was one of the first sitcoms with two principal characters who were gay. And again, what was revolutionary about that show was that you had one character who was a flamboyant performer, but another character was a reserved professional. And they were both out gay, and they were both interesting characters. And it lasted for several years. I think the show was on for 8 years, which is very long in the sitcom world. Now, the 1990s, which culminated in these moments with Ellen and Will and Grace and ultimately Queer Eye for the Straight Guy, had been a very challenging decade for gay rights. There was the raising of a surprise possibility for state recognition of gay marriage after a Supreme Court decision in the state of Hawaii in 1993. But that was soon slammed shut, both by Hawaii and by several other states who were worried about having to recognize weddings from other states that were for same-sex couples. So there were a series of state constitutional amendments defining marriage as between one man and one woman, and ultimately a federal Defense of Marriage Act, which passed in 1996. And I just want to point out something I learned in reading about this in preparation for tonight. That vote to pass the Defense of Marriage Act passed by over 75% of the House in favor and 85 to 15 in the Senate. So rejecting same-sex marriage in 1996 was a surprisingly, from our perspective, a surprisingly overwhelming decision by Congress at that time. And it was signed by Democrat Bill Clinton, who himself a few years earlier had backtracked from at first saying that gays and lesbians should be able to serve openly in the military to accepting a compromise called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Now, all of these issues from 25 years ago feel like another planet, given the progress of just our past decade since 2011. And this summer I watched, or this spring rather, I watched the docu-film Milk, about Harvey Milk in San Francisco in the 1970s. And again, I was struck by what a different world it was that people who were gay in the 1970s had to grapple with. And then you think about the AIDS activism of the 1980s and how this world we're living in for people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or even transgender is so radically different. In the last 25 years, since the mid-90s, since Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and the Federal Defense of Marriage Act, there have been a number of Supreme Court decisions and new laws that have, for example, canceled sodomy laws that banned homosexual or gay sex in 2003. That was the famous Lawrence versus Texas decision. Congress repealed Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2011. So it only lasted for about 15 years. And states that authorized gay marriages had them recognized by the federal government by a Supreme Court decision in 2013. And ultimately in 2015 came the momentous Obergefell decision that acknowledged the universal right that love should be love and that gay people had the right to be married anywhere. Let me pull a name from the past. Do you remember who Kim Davis was? I sort of set it up by the topic, but Kim Davis was a local county clerk in Kentucky who decided she would refuse to grant any same-sex marriage licenses, even though the Supreme Court said it was the law of the land. And she became a cause célèbre for a limited period of time, and now she's a trivial pursuit question. She's a historical footnote. Pride parades are big business these days. They're broadly accepted in major cities with almost no counter-protesters. You know, it's the Westboro Baptist Church, the fringes, that are protesting these days, at least in most major cities. I even saw on Facebook that Lego Toys issued a special Lego set for Pride Month this year with a whole rainbow of different colored human figures. Now we know that what the Supreme Court giveth, the Supreme Court can taketh away. We're aware of this. And we're also aware of the ongoing challenges regarding laws aimed at transgender children, especially focused on the use of bathrooms and playing sports, because that's the leverage that the haters can use. But we also know, with all that precariousness and challenge, that many of the changes for the good are here to stay. One of the current Supreme Court cases that you'll hear about in the next several months is called Fulton versus the City of Philadelphia. But what makes this revolutionary is who's on what side here. It's not an individual suing the City of Philadelphia. It's the City of Philadelphia that was trying to force an adoption agency to accept same-sex partner families as foster families. The city wants to emphasize the civil rights protection of equal protection for same-sex families over and above the religious freedom rights of a Catholic adoption agency to discriminate against them. And so we are not fighting City Hall. In many ways, City Hall is fighting the fight for us. Now, I am not an expert on LGBTQ rights. I have multiple members of my family who are part of that rainbow of identities, but that's not really the focus of our discussion today. This is just the context for what I really want to talk about. Because what I really would like to discuss today is how LGBTQ progress has transformed Jewish life and what changes might still be to come. In many ways, there are parallels to the experience of Jewish feminism. People sometimes ask, what was the best era in Jewish life? Was it in the days of the writing of the Talmud or the kings of Israel? The reality is the best era in Jewish life has to be now, because now, post the feminist revolution, we have more people involved in creating and leading and articulating Jewish life than ever before, because we have the full involvement of the other half of the Jewish people in all but the most strictly Orthodox sects. Now, traditionally, the response to same-sex attraction and behavior was relatively unambiguous. You can read it in Leviticus 18, where it's listing all of the prohibited sexual contacts that one might have or think of having. So in verse 20, you have here, do not have carnal relations with your neighbor's wife and defile yourself with her. Do not allow any of your children to be offered up in a child sacrifice to Moloch, and do not profane the name of your God. And here's the key line in verse 22. Ve'et zachar lo tishkav mishkavei isha to'eva hi. Do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is an abhorrence, a to'ava, a terrible thing. And then immediately following, in verse 23, do not have carnal relations with any beast and defile yourself thereby. Do not let a woman lend herself to a beast to mate with it. That is also a perversion. Do not defile yourselves in any of those ways, because that's what those other nations did that I cast out before you. They defiled themselves, and I called them to account for the land's iniquity, and the land spewed out its inhabitants. Do not do any of these abhorrent things. And if you do them, of course, the land will spew you out for defiling it. And any person who does this thing, all these to'evot, all these abhorrent things in the same word as in verse 20 that we saw, such persons shall be cut off from their people. So you have a relatively unambiguous statement of prohibiting this kind of behavior. However, I will point out, and others have pointed this out too, it's focused specifically on male same-sex attraction and sexual content. It doesn't say anything about a woman who lies with a woman as with a man. Some have said that this means that lesbianism is on a somewhat lower plane of prohibition from male homosexuality. In fact, there's a famous story about this you may have already heard related to Passover, where a couple of lesbian activists who were involved in Jewish life, I think it was at Smith College, went to a local rabbi and asked him, what's the status of lesbianism given this absolute prohibition on male homosexuality? Because in many cases, women are not seen as sexual beings in traditional religious structures, including Judaism. And the rabbi's response was, well, lesbianism is seen as a kind of minor sin, like having bread on Passover. So that next year, these Jewish activists decided to put a piece of pita bread on their Seder plate, intentionally violating the prohibition on leavened bread, to make the point that if they're willing to commit one sin of that magnitude, they'll do another one too. And a woman theologian was there who saw this and certainly sympathized with their perspectives, but wanted to maintain the kosher status of her Seder table. And so she came up with the idea of using an orange on the Seder plate instead of the pita bread. So originally, the idea of the orange on the Seder plate was not about involving women in Jewish life. It was about involving lesbians and gays in Jewish life. But as the story evolved and was told by word of mouth, it became a story about women's inclusion in the rabbinate and in leadership. And the LG side of it was lost. But that was the original background. It was based on, in fact, this passage that describes the prohibition on male homosexuality, but is silent on what women might do with women. In general, if you read through rabbinic literature as well, there are passages in the Bible that do allude to some sort of male connection to other males, most specifically David and Jonathan. You can read passages where David says, and Jonathan say to each other, your love to me is more sweet than the love of women. And this is platonic, or is it more? Well, there are suggestions it may indeed have been more. But the dominant strain is to say that this is prohibited. It's seen as deviance. It's seen as spilling your seed in vain, which one is not allowed to do. By the way, the rabbis were also opposed to male masturbation. And most importantly, it's seen, as you've seen even here, as one of the non-Jewish practices. Those non-Jews do that, but we don't do that. We're the holy people who are on a higher plane. So clearly in Jewish halakha and Jewish law and Jewish culture and custom historically, this was not permitted behavior. Now, when we look at these issues from a modern perspective and from a modern Jewish perspective, we understand that many of them are very far in the rearview mirror for liberal Jewish denominations who are happy to advocate for homosexual, lesbian, gay, transgender, and queer human rights, civil rights, marriage rights, inheritance rights, and Jewish rights. The RITES, that is the ability to fully participate in Jewish community practice. Now, in the Orthodox world, it's still maybe a generation behind in the conversation. There was a famous documentary in the year 2001 called Trembling Before God, which tried to explore what it meant to identify as both an Orthodox Jew and as someone who is lesbian or gay, and the challenging position they found themselves in and the response of their communities to this. By the way, many Orthodox communities are still in favor of what's called conversion therapy to try to get gay people straight. And unfortunately, like in the fundamentalist Christian world, it has caused tremendous trauma for people put through these kind of therapies. But even so, in at least the modern Orthodox world, there's a growing awareness of the kind of trauma that lesbian and gay Jews in the Orthodox world are experiencing, including some tragic suicides caused by the pressures they feel they're under. It's still officially rejected, but the attempt is to try to be more tolerant and at least forgiving, if not permissive. Every year, there are two major pride parades that take place in Israel. The Tel Aviv Pride Parade is one of the largest pride parades in the world. The Jerusalem Pride Parade has one of the largest police presences of any pride parade in the world, in part because a number of ultra-Orthodox activists are very, very opposed to it. And there was even a tragic case of a woman who was stabbed to death at the Jerusalem Pride Parade a few years ago because of the absolute rejection by some of the most Orthodox in Jerusalem, who are trying to impose their values on the world around them. But as I said, for most liberal Jews, this is in the rearview mirror. They've processed these issues and have come to some inclusive and accepting solutions to the incorporation and response to lesbian, gay, and bisexual and transgender Jews in Jewish life. So the first question that a Jewish movement had to ask was, well, do we allow people to be lesbian or gay? We'll talk about the transgender in a moment. Are people allowed to live their life as the person they really are? And not just how they identify personally, but can they actually live out their life? Can they have gay sex? Again, the liberal Jewish world has accepted reality that people are going to do what people are going to do, and people should be celebrated for finding love wherever they find that. And so that is, again, a question that all the modern liberal movements have moved beyond, again, at different stages and different times. But as we'll see, some of them were relatively early. In fact, the Reform movement issued a statement in 1977 that affirmed that same-sex loving behavior should not be criminalized, which was much farther in advance of the Supreme Court decision in 2003. That's a case where religion was ahead of the general culture instead of behind it. Second question, should congregations tolerate non-straight members? Should they accept queer members? Should they celebrate same-sex partnerships or lesbian and gay members as individuals or even as families? This was challenging for many congregations who, by the way, in the 1970s weren't that good on intermarried families either, but on same-sex families as well. They were rejectionist, uncomfortable. They were bourgeois. They were, acclimating into the broader society in that period. So a number of gay Jews wound up founding gay synagogues. In Chicago, for example, a synagogue was founded in 1975 called Or Hadash. And there is still a congregation, Beit Simchat Torah, in New York, and there's another famous congregation, I think it's Sha'ar Zahav in San Francisco. By the way, Sha'ar Zahav in Hebrew means gate of gold. So that's where they got the name for the synagogue, from the Golden Gate Bridge. But these were congregations that were founded by gay Jews for gay Jews. And they met the needs at that particular moment. By the way, if you try to find Or Hadash in Chicago, it isn't around anymore. In 2016, they were down to 60 households, and they decided to merge with another congregation, a Reform congregation, because as the current president said, we no longer need a separate congregation. The general Jewish world has moved to where we were, and we feel comfortable being part of that broader Jewish community. We didn't need a separate gay synagogue anymore to feel fully included and welcome in Jewish life. Now, one challenge, by the way, that I know Congregation Sha'ar Zahav has had in San Francisco is there are straight couples that want to join the gay synagogue because they like their approach to gender identity and their approach to inclusiveness and intermarried families and the style of prayer services. And so that congregation had to have a debate over whether they would allow straight couples to join the gay synagogue because that was more attractive than the other options out there. Again, that's in the rearview mirror for many liberal congregations. Now that's about the congregation accepting people. What about rabbis? Can rabbis themselves be queer in their sexual identities or even in their gender? And this is something that, again, has seen a lot of progress beginning in the 1990s. The Reform movement accepted gay rabbis beginning in 1990. The conservative movement didn't really accept LGBTQ rabbis until 2006. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But our movement of secular and humanistic Judaism, in fact, one of our founding rabbis, Sherwin Wein, himself was gay, although he wasn't as out about his identity until much later in his career, into the 2000s. But that was in a part of the generation that he was in and in the context he found himself. But in 2003 and 2004, the Association of Humanistic Rabbis issued a statement in support of diverse sexualities and gender identities. We talked about legal issues, discrimination, civil rights and liberties. We talked about not only our right, but our desire that our members would perform weddings and commitment ceremonies for same-sex couples and signed legal marriage license wherever these were possible. Again, this was before the Obergefell decision. And then in 2016, it was pointed out to us that we were missing something. And so we added the last section at the bottom. Because the Association of Humanistic Rabbis celebrates the range of contributions that LGBTQ plus persons make to our movement as lay members and leaders, as well as teachers and rabbis, we invite all lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people and their families who are attracted to humanistic Judaism to become active members, leaders, and rabbis in our communities and our movement. It was important for us to add the "and rabbis," the leadership, the full involvement to the point of leading communities to be part of that inclusive messaging. It simply wasn't inclusive enough without being explicit on that front. And so that's why we felt the need to include that. Now, as I mentioned, the reform movement and conservative movement today, at least in the United States, not necessarily in Canada or in Israel, do accept same-sex attracted individuals, lesbians, gays, or bisexuals, however they identify, to become rabbis, although the conservative movement was kind of split when they were making this decision, because they were stuck with the explicit words of Leviticus and rabbinic law, and yet they wanted to be more inclusive. So in the end, the Committee on Law and Standards of the conservative movement issued two decisions. One decision said, no, they can't be rabbis. And the other decision said, yes, they can be rabbis, but the whole gay sex thing is still something we have to debate. But they can be gay, and so the identity was separated from the behavior in that decision. The end result is that each conservative congregation can choose whether they want to hire one or not. And the rabbinic seminaries in California or in New York are free to ordain gay rabbis, which they have done since 2006. And those rabbis are now on the job market, and they are looking for congregations that will accept them. And it's hit or miss sometimes whether that will work in the conservative movement. But you have gay rabbis who have been in charge of the Reconstructionist movement, of the Humanistic Judaism, obviously, the Reform movement as well. And so they are fully welcome to be leaders in the community as a sign of their full inclusion in Jewish life. And so the last question that is in the rearview mirror for most of these movements is, should rabbis officiate at same-sex ceremonies? Because that's a public affirmation of this kind of partnership, this kind of life. So I want to share with you the statement that the Reform movement put out in the year 2000 about officiation at same-gender ceremonies. And it actually has a nice summary of their history on the issue. In 1977, it points out the Central Conference of American Rabbis, CCAR, adopted a resolution calling for legislation decriminalizing homosexual acts between consenting adults and an end to discrimination. In 1990, they endorsed the report of the Ad Hoc Committee on Homosexuality in the Rabbinate, which urged that all rabbis be accorded the opportunity to fulfill the sacred vocation they have chosen, and all Jews are religiously equal, regardless of sexual orientation. Again, that was the vocabulary of the day. All rabbinic graduates would be admitted into CCR membership. It did describe some differing views on the nature of kiddushin, which is the sanctification of marriage. In 1996, a resolution supported the right of civil marriage, and two CCAR committees explored that question of, could we in fact officiate at these ceremonies? Unfortunately, that committee, by a majority of 7-2, concluded that homosexual relationships, again, their words, however exclusive and committed they may be, do not fit within this legal category. They are not called kiddushin, and therefore we do not understand Jewish marriage. They said, unfortunately, they could not get consensus on this, but the majority said no. But a mere 4 years later, after that committee on the responsa addressed this question, decided instead that it should happen. In fact, even 2 years later, another committee in '98 said by a majority of 11-1, with the one as an abstention, that kedusha or holiness may be present in committed same-gender relationships between two Jews. And therefore, the CCR resolved in 2000 that we do hereby resolve the relationship of a Jewish same-gender couple is worthy of affirmation through appropriate Jewish ritual. They recognize the diversity of opinion, so it's not mandatory. Some might choose not to do it, but we call on everyone to support their colleagues and develop both educational and liturgical resources in this area. I will point out, by the way, you'll notice, even in that ad hoc committee statement earlier, Kiddusha is present in same-gender relationships between two Jews, a Jewish same-gender couple in the resolution. So they're still opposed to intermarriage, even for same-sex couples. But they're at least moving forward in terms of finding a way to sanctify those. And they point out we have to develop new materials for this, new educational resources and new liturgy. Because when you write a ketubah text, it's going to be different if you're talking about two men or two women. The grammar changes in Hebrew, and the blessings are going to change. The traditional 7 blessings are designed for a man and a woman explicitly. And so that's going to have to change. Now, once you decide to make the change, of course, the question becomes, how far do you go? And this was a debate in the early 1980s with Jewish feminism, too. Are Jewish women's issues merely sociological issues, like who's allowed to be synagogue president and can they become a rabbi? Or as the theologian Judith Plaskow put it, is the right question theological? Do we have to talk about the deeper issues here? So what are the issues beyond those practical questions that are in the rearview mirror for most liberal movements that are raised by our current moment in 2021? Well, as one example, the vocabulary has changed. It's not just lesbian and gay or homosexual, it's LGBTQIAA+, and I'm leaving out a couple, I know. Just to unpack what those are, if you're not familiar with the full acronyms, you have lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer as sort of an umbrella term. I is intersex. A can be asexual. Another A can be androgynous. Plus is for whatever new terms are going to be added later. Some would add a P for pansexual, and so on and so on. So, you know, it's getting to be many, many letters to try to be more precise for the labels that people choose for themselves. The concept of being non-binary and not fitting into either male or female, or being gender fluid between those. That's also something that we are grappling with today. And that's why things have been highlighted and challenged for us about gender issues. This is one of the first challenges I think we'll be grappling with from today going forward. And these have been highlighted by transgender and non-binary people. There are allusions to gender experiences beyond the binary simple male, simple female in rabbinic literature, because they saw that people were born looking somewhat different in some variety of forms. But these were not accepted as normative alternatives. They were seen as the weird cases we have to resolve in one way or the other. Judaism is a very gender binary system. Just think about Genesis chapter 1. Male and female, he created them. You have a male and a female. That's it. In rabbinic literature, there's a whole major section of law that's called the order of women. There is no order of men, by the way. That's the default. But there's a whole section for the category of men and women and how men are supposed to deal with them and their quirky cases like menstruation and marriage contracts and divorces and ketubas and all that kind of stuff. And it even comes down to the very basic level of Hebrew grammar. As is the case in other languages too, if you have a group of women and one man in the group, the verb takes the male form. The pronouns take the male plural form. If you have a mixed group, it's going to take the male forms. You have to have only women in the group to take the female form. There's a wonderful poem by the Israeli poet Yonah Wallach that has the key line, Hebrew is a sex maniac. You can't even tell what someone is doing or ask how they are or who they are until you know what their gender is. Because the very word for you, if I'm asking who are you, I need to know, is it who are you to a man or who are you to a woman? Because the word for you is different in the two. And it comes up every time you read a traditional blessing, because when you're talking to God, you're saying Baruch atah, you male, unless you're willing to change those forms. You want to have a rite of passage, you're turning 13? Sorry, you got to fit in the slot. Bar mitzvah for boys, bat mitzvah for girls, one or the other. Well, modern creativity has come up with new solutions to this. So for one example, our congregation uses the term B mitzvah, just the letter B. Could stand for bar, bat, or simply being good. Other congregations use the term brit mitzvah as a covenant of doing good deeds. And then it's about the event, but not about the person. In some congregations, they have to understand how to refer to people's family names. If you're called up for an aliyah, for a Torah reading, you're usually called up by your so-and-so, son of so-and-so, or so-and-so daughter of so-and-so. Well, if you don't fit into either son or daughter, what do you do? Well, maybe you say from the house of, and then the family name. And then you don't have to get into the son or daughter of in an aliyah or in a memorial prayer. And even the very language of the prayers themselves are often written as a male speaker talking to a male God. Now, in a synagogue context where men were always leading the prayers, it made sense. But in a synagogue context where the majority of people graduating as rabbis from Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and Humanistic rabbinic seminaries are women, writing the prayers in male grammar just doesn't make sense. Now, maybe making those changes is less of an issue for the more liberal branches like Reform or Humanistic Judaism, because we've been changing liturgy for 200 years. But we have to find the right way to balance our continuity with tradition with the values that we find most important in living our integrity. So the gender issues, I think, will be one of the major change points going forward. A second one related to that is the heteronormativity of organized Jewish life. We crossed this bridge some years ago in our congregation. We had always historically done, going back to our days in our precursor congregation of Congregation Beth Or, we had held a model wedding. And there were explicit parts listed in the model wedding script. They included the mother of the bride, the father of the bride, the mother of the groom, the father of the groom, the bride, the groom, the best man, the maid of honor. It was a classic heteronormative style wedding. And it was modeled on traditional Jewish practice. And you watch the scene from Fiddler on the Roof at the wedding. And, it was thought to be a way to celebrate Jewish culture. And then one year, we had no grooms volunteer. We just had two girls that wanted to be the bride. And the teachers asked me, do we have a problem with two brides at our model wedding? And I said, no, because I do those kind of weddings happily. So we had two brides that year. The next year, next time around, we had two grooms for the wedding, because after all, a fair proportion of the students in our school have themselves parents of the same gender or have family members like of same-sex partnerships and families led by same-sex parents. So this is the world we live in, and it means we have to change some things. We might have to learn grammar differently too. I'll show you one example of an organization that's trying to address this challenge of non-binary Hebrew. What if you yourself are neither male nor female? You identify as non-binary. There's no grammar for you in Hebrew because you're either a Talmid, a student, male, or a Talmidah, a student, female. Well, at the University of Colorado in Boulder, or University of Denver, maybe, I'm trying to remember, it's one of these Colorado-based universities, they're working on a non-binary gender system. So a student would become a Talmideh. It's not Talmidah, it's not Talmid, it's somewhere in the middle. And if it's plural, and this is something you hear in Israel as well, you use both plural endings. It's not Talmidim, students for male or a mixed group, or Talmidot, students for a female-only group. It's Talmidimot. You'd put emote at the end of everything. In fact, my daughter's summer camp does this too. For their campers, their chanichimot, they put the emote double plural ending at the end of every plural. And that's a way to try to include both. Or one other example is a new font that's being developed in Israel that allows you to write both male and female at the same time. So this word could be read as Baruchim Habaim or Baruchot Habaot, which means welcome to both a group of men, a group of women, and all together. And the idea is to try to be gender inclusive by saying all at once. And we even had a surprise experience 10 years ago where an organization called PJ Library, which gives out free Jewish books to families of raising younger kids, put out a book with a same-sex household called the Purim Superhero, I think it was called, where one parent was called Dad and one parent was called Abba, which is the Hebrew term for daddy. And they didn't want to send it to everybody because they were worried about the response. So they printed a limited number and you had to request it. And they sold out in like 30 minutes because almost all the liberal Jews that were getting this book wanted to see and wanted their children to see that kind of a family presented as a normative example of a Jewish family in children's literature. So there are going to be a lot of changes that have to take place. I noticed just last summer, in fact, that my wedding spreadsheet where I keep track of the names of all my couples, said bride and groom on the column headers. I mean, I'm happy to do same-sex ceremonies. That didn't affect it, but I should really change that spreadsheet because I'm not only doing bride and groom weddings. One time in signing ketubas, I'll often tell the story from the Hebrew Bible where a groom married the wrong bride by not checking to make sure it was the right one before we signed the ketubah. So I have the couple turn to each other and they have a nice moment. But when I did that for a two-men ceremony, they said, you know, for us, any bride would be the wrong bride because it was only a groom that would work for them. Or another example of creative response to this was one of the first same-sex ceremonies they did for two men. They had their friends choose 7 blessings that would be original to them. And because the traditional 7 blessings are so heteronormative. And one of them was a genius. He quoted from Fiddler on the Roof. A blessing on your house, mazel tov, mazel tov. Imagine such a spouse, mazel tov, mazel tov. And such a son-in-law like no one ever saw, David and Jeremy. Because they were both going to be sons-in-law. But it was a wonderful citation of modern Jewish culture reapplied to this kind of a ceremony. So that will be another point of change of getting beyond the binary in Jewish life. And then finally, we have to confront the reality that there's always the unknown unknowns. This is, attributed to Donald Rumsfeld, trying to be obscure, but in fact, it's a very valuable concept. There are the known unknowns, the things you know you don't know, but there's the unknown unknowns, the things we don't even know that we don't know. The issues that animated gay rights in the 1970s were different from the push for same-sex marriage in the 1990s through the early 2010s, and the gender issues we're grappling with today are different again. Now, I want to point out, those issues were always there. We just didn't understand them well, or we understood them differently, or we really didn't understand them at all. The important part of progress we have to recognize is 2 key steps. The first is saying, oops, I didn't realize. And the second is, sorry, I need to learn more and to do better. And so that's what society has gradually learned to do with the L and the G and the B. We're getting there on the T. The QIAA+, that's going to be the next 10 years. And we'll see where we go from there.